as I was thinking about that statement of if you want it, then you shouldn't have it, I was thinking, no, the person who wants it but won't admit to themselves that they want it is the person who shouldn't have it.
Yeah.
If you know you want it and you're a good faith actor, then what that means is now you're responsible to that desire.
Yeah.
And the positions that you would take were you to find yourself in a place of leadership.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we want to talk about personality types and leadership. I think leadership is a loaded word. When you hear the word leadership, you listening right now, what image comes up for you in your mind? I'll just ask you, Antonia, because you are sitting here right now. The person listening doesn't have a microphone. They're just listening with us, but
I have a microphone.
You do. And what do you think of when I say the word leadership? What comes up as a picture in your mind? The first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, you and I have been talking about leadership a lot, so there might be a bit of a bottleneck of ideas in my head right this moment. But when you asked me this before, I would almost say that not very much came up at all. It was, I don't actually think about leadership that much. I don't consider it. I don't think about it. I don't desire it. It's not something that really is highly relevant to me. So when I think about leadership, I generally go to, well, I'll say this, I go to abstractions of definitions.
Yeah.
Like what could leadership be? What makes up, the concept of leadership?
Yeah.
But I don't really see a specific person. I don't see a specific position. I just think of the abstraction of what it means to lead.
Yeah. I would imagine that you listening right now, if you're like most people, when I say leadership, the image most people have in their mind is the boss. Mm-hmm. The boss of the company or the person you work for or the person that tells you what to do every day at your work. Sometimes it could be maybe a leader in a community organization, like maybe a church, like church leadership, something like that. But the other image often people have then is like military leadership. And I would say that most people, if it's not an abstraction like you're talking about, Antonia, if it's like the real experience of leadership, like I'm following a leader, almost always I think the image people have is inside of some type of hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
Some type of institution. From my viewpoint, I think it's very positional in people's minds. It's like, oh, that's the leader. That's who we follow. That's who we listen to. That's who gets to call the shots.
Yeah.
And we know that's not, even though that's the image we all bring up, many of us know that's not actually what true leadership is. That's positional leadership. And in fact, if you look at any leadership book or business book, often they'll talk about, you can be a leader without having the position or the title, be a leader without the title, be a leader in your organization, influence people around you without the title or the position. And so I think in the public consciousness, even though we immediately have the image of hierarchy and structure and the boss, quote unquote, I think we have now in our public consciousness this notion that, oh, I can take leadership or take the lead in something even if I don't have the position. I think that is a modern idea that maybe we don't always initially think of, but it does come to us if we sit with that for a moment.
I think you're right. It might be that the reason why nothing really comes to mind is I haven't been in a situation where, like a hierarchical situation, where other people are above me for a while.
Yeah.
Like I haven't really belonged to any sort of institution for a very long time. And, we co-own Personality Hacker, so
we do have employees.
I mean, I guess I'm the leader. And again, I that's not really something that I think about. And so that's probably why it goes blank, because the person who I should be thinking about, I'm just sort of setting that aside. And I know this about myself because there are ways in which I do want to have leadership. I think of it as influence, right? It's become almost trite now, but the first time I heard the phrase thought leader, I was like, yes, if there's any kind of leadership that I would desire, it's the ability to influence how people think about things. But I also know that I'm a little allergic to the idea of the responsibility that comes along with that. And I know that about myself. I know that leadership is not that attractive to me, in part because it makes a person very responsible. And I don't really like being responsible for people outside of myself. So leadership is something I've never really desired or pursued. And yet at the same time, I absolutely have desired and pursued it because, as I said before, I have a microphone.
Yeah.
For some reason, I believe that people should be listening to how I'm thinking about things. And that clearly is me putting myself in some form of leadership.
So let's go down that road, because I think it's going to unlock the ability for us to talk about this from a personality type lens. Yours and my personal experience and how we see this a little differently. I think a lot of people see leadership differently. I think they've got a very different relationship to it. And I bet you it's dependent on their cognitive wiring, their personality type. So when you say that I like the idea of being a thought leader, but the idea of leadership and the responsibility makes me a little nervous. Is it because when you hear the word leadership or you think of leaders, it's driving toward a specific outcome, and thought leadership allows you just to influence thoughts without having to be responsible for an outcome? Unpack that a little bit more for me.
Yeah. When I mentioned, I think of it kind of conceptually, I think a part of that is the idea of being able to corral people. Herding cats. Well, here we go. Here's some visualizations coming up for me. Maybe I just need to talk about it. But the idea of herding cats, like getting people together and in cooperation with each other to all be pointed towards a specific goal or outcome. And while I do know that there are other brands and forms of leadership other than just making something happen, I do think that if you set yourself in a position of leadership and you succeed and you manage to get people paying attention to you, that's the first thing you have to do, is get people to pay attention to you. And then you have to engender, in some form, you have to engender loyalty. Even if that's not loyalty to you as an individual, it's just loyalty to the position that you've taken. And then you have to establish some form of credibility for why other people should be listening to you. It could be the position, but it could be, a transfer of trust from somebody else, or maybe you are highly capable or competent and people see that and read it and assume that that's transferable to whatever it is that you're doing. So you've managed to get yourself in a position, or you've either created it or you stepped into it. And now you have a bunch of people who are like, okay, so what would you like us to go do then? And you don't have anything for them. And this is something that we've kind of struggled with a little bit in this, before we had programs or places where we could help people take what they're learning and apply it to their lives. When you gather attention and energy towards you and you have no place to funnel it, people don't just go, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll go somewhere else. It's like a souring.
Yeah.
And I think the responsibility that I shirk away from is this idea of people handing me that level of responsibility to now be directive. Go do this, go make this happen, go handle this. And it's my responsibility to make sure everybody's doing that. And it's my responsibility to make sure that everybody's in cooperation. And then that thing fundamentally, the outcome that I directed ends up happening. That all sounds real big to me. It's like, do I really want to be doing that? Or do I want to just talk in a microphone and hope it works out? Yeah. And so I know that about myself, though. I don't have any delusions that I should be in positions of leadership as long as I feel that way. I know there is that concept of the reluctant leader.
Yeah.
It's close to the reluctant hero. And there are some people who find themselves in positions of leadership reluctantly. And while the image is nice and it sounds like that's the highest qualified person, the person who just is so good at leading that everybody hands it over to them, but they've never wanted it, I think that's a fantasy. I think most people in positions of leadership are people who want to be there. They have very intentionally gotten themselves there.
Yeah.
Hopefully, fingers crossed, they've done the work to become qualified for that place. And the people who don't really want it don't hone the necessary skills to just be this amazing, awesome, natural leader that everybody just wants to hand their followership over to. Yeah. And I guess I'll just do it. Like, I know that that's more fantasy than it is reality.
Yeah. So you mentioned people that want to have it. I think there's a cost to being in leadership.
Oh, yeah.
I think when we look at leaders, especially if we're not in a leadership position ourselves, I've been in this place in my life where I've been a follower. I've been on the receiving end of other people's leadership. To me, it's like, wow, that person or persons, they get all the privilege. They get all the benefit. They get to call the shots. They don't have to follow maybe all the quote unquote structural rules of the organization like I do. They get to have X, Y, Z. And so rose-colored glasses from the viewpoint of a follower, I've been there. And then stepping into leadership, especially, I would argue, good leadership, requires you to set aside elements of yourself your own will, your own desires, the things that maybe you would do, maybe be a little less curated or careful with your words or how you show up, because you're not just leading through the things you say, but also the things you do, the way you behave. All of this sends a signal to people. And so it can be challenging because you have to give up some of the free-form nature, maybe the freedom that you once had, to step into that leadership. And you get a little privilege with it, but often the privilege, from my experience having been in multiple different positions of leadership, the privilege does not equal what you have to give up. The things you have to give up to be there, from my experience, way outpace the privilege or the benefits of being in that position.
If you're doing it right.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of people avoid it because of the responsibility and the freedom they lose. And there's a little bit of uncertainty. Like, do I want all of that? That's too much pressure on somebody? And so a lot of people don't necessarily seek that out. We had a conversation with a friend recently, and I was expressing to this person how much I desire to be in leadership roles. I perceive myself at this time of my life as somebody who shows up wanting to serve a group by taking charge, taking the lead, helping drive things forward, setting the tone, casting a vision, helping us get there. I was expressing that to this person. I said, I would like to be in charge of it. I like to be the lead. And they looked at me and said, well, based on the fact you desire that means you should not be qualified to step into that position. You shouldn't have it because you want it. Mm. And I had a real visceral, intense reaction to that. Not like upset and yell about it, but I was like, wait, that feels weird. Why would I want to do something that I don't want to do? Why would I step into a leadership role, or why would anyone want to step into leadership? Because the way this person was talking, it's almost like, well, if the person doesn't want it, then they're more qualified than you because they'll be more pure of heart maybe. Or, I mean, they didn't say this, but this is what the inference was. More pure of heart, less about themselves, less about their own ego, less about their own desires. They'll be more altruistic when they get to that space, that position. Mm. And again, that just doesn't match up to me because it's how much responsibility you have to take on and how much you have to give up to step into that role. From my experience, maybe people have different experiences from that, but that's been my experience. It doesn't ring true as much for me.
I could see a person feeling that way. Like you said, that there's some sort of purity of heart in that. If you want leadership, then I think the assumption is that you're like you're greedy for something.
Yeah.
But
or you're a power monger. You just want power over people.
Right. Yeah. And I do think that there is something to be said for you having introverted feeling or authenticity as one of your first two functions. Well, what that means, I mean, a little bit could be attributed to extroverted thinking or effectiveness as your 10-year-old or tertiary, like that idea of like wanting to be in control of the resources, including people and manning the projects and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I actually think your statement was more closely aligned to your introverted feeling or authenticity co-pilot or auxiliary function, which is like, I just know my intentions and motivations. I know what I want. Yeah. I know what the desire of my heart is. And this is one of those things. Whereas I think that people of other types sometimes are more self-conscious of their desires. Well, actually, even some FP types.
Yeah.
When they want something, they won't reveal it or share it because they're afraid of people's judgment.
So that's a huge learning. Like if you're listening right now, one of the things in your relationship to leadership is if you want it, if you desire it, owning that about yourself.
Yes.
Saying, I want to be in the lead. I want leadership. Like the moment I admitted that to myself and didn't try to keep obfuscating it, pretending like I didn't want the power and the leadership and the ability to affect change and drive toward a goal and help us all accomplish that. The moment I surrendered to, yeah, that's what I want. And I say it unapologetically. Well, now I don't have that as a thing I'm contending with anymore.
Yeah, it's not jerking your chain from the shadows.
I'm not individual. I'm not duplicitous in it. Like I've got a congruency with what I want and what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm owning it. And so I would recommend to you listening, if it's something you desire, find a way to completely, fully own it.
Yeah.
On your side.
Yeah, because I would actually say that, I mean, it's interesting that it turned this direction, the conversation, because as I was thinking about that statement of if you want it, then you shouldn't have it, I was thinking, no, the person who wants it but won't admit to themselves that they want it is the person who shouldn't have it.
Yeah.
If you know you want it and you're a good faith actor, then what that means is now you're responsible to that desire.
Yeah.
And the positions that you would take were you to find yourself in a place of leadership. Before we do any podcast, whatever is the topic, I tend to go look up the etymology of the relevant words, because I just find that helps me get an idea of what is it that we're talking about here. And the definition of leadership, or the etymology, leader being one and ship being the other. For leading or leader, the root of those, or the etymology of that word, is effectively somebody who is at the front of something, but not at the top. But it wasn't so much somebody who's at the top of a hierarchy, but is in the front of a group of people. And they're leading, right? They're guiding groups of people through a terrain, effectively, was the origination point of that word.
Yeah.
And there was almost like a relationship to the word scout or scouting, which is you've already run ahead, seen what's coming, run back and gone, okay, I know the best way to navigate through this territory. And so a lead or a leader was more like a guide or a scout. Now, we think of leadership in terms of leading projects, leading movements, leading organizations or institutions, sometimes leading thought, right? Being an influencer, leading trends. And what we usually are looking for in those situations are people who have already navigated this terrain. They know what they're talking about because they've been here before. It's hard to get coaching advice about parenting from people who aren't parents. It's hard to get coaching advice from, people about relationships where they've never, they haven't had a 10-year-long relationship.
Yeah.
You're looking for people who've already been here, and they go, okay, so I've mapped this area and this is what it looks like. So it's not really about somebody who's on top. It's about somebody who's at the front. And then the word ship, the pi root of that word is very similar to the word shape. And that effectively means to cut or mold yourself into this thing that you're doing. Because the word ship actually just means like the will to do, or doing this activity. But I thought it was interesting that it was associated with something that is about, sort of changing yourself.
Yeah. And
a related concept is the word friendship. Like, you tend to alter who you are just by merit of the fact that you're in a dynamic, you're in a relationship with this person, right? A friendship. The position itself starts to mold and change you because you're now, being influenced by that person or that position itself. So leadership is really about understanding the importance of traversing something on your own and then coming and that changing you, right? Or rather, having traversed it, feeling a responsibility to help other people go through that same situation, coming back, leading and guiding them through it, and then being changed by the experience of the responsibility.
Yeah.
So I think when somebody desires leadership, I think what they are saying, whether they know it or not, is I'd like to be in a position where I'm helping other people get through something that is difficult for them, that's hard, that maybe nobody else is qualified for, or other people are qualified, but they're just not stepping up. And I'm willing to put myself in a position that's going to change me, which is why earlier when you said that there are sacrifices, and those sacrifices, oftentimes, if you're doing it right, outweigh the privileges that come along with leadership.
Yeah.
Part of the sacrifice is yourself. You don't get to be 100% autonomous. You don't get to not be changed by this responsibility. It's a very similar dynamic to parenting. Parenting is going to change you by merit of the fact that you are now responsible for the situation. You can't not be changed as a parent. It just is going to. And I think leadership is a very similar dynamic.
Yes. And so I think, by the way, I completely agree with everything you just said. I also would say that there are privileges and benefits to stepping into leadership. Often they are related to the role itself, though, like the benefit or the satisfaction of leading a group of people through an endeavor toward a goal. Like there's a certain type of person that's wired to enjoy being able to move people, even if they don't get personal credit for it, being able to see an entire objective accomplished, or a person, like a big people group moving towards something, there's a satisfaction that comes from that, often for a certain type of person. I think I'm wired that way. I really enjoy, like, if you come to one of our live events, yeah, I'm on stage, I'm leading and all of that, but I really enjoy watching, 60 to 100 people go through an experience over 3 to 5 days, greater than the sum of its parts. And it's such a privilege. That's the greatest privilege. That's the greatest benefit, is seeing all of that come to fruition, and other people getting lit up and turned on to themselves and their life and what they can do. All the excitement that comes from that, that's the payoff, as far as I'm concerned, for, I believe, somebody that's in a true position of leadership. And when I say position, I don't actually mean position. I mean a role of leadership, because what leadership is not is simply a position, like we talked about before. Even though we have this image of a hierarchy or a structure, that's not necessarily what we mean by leadership. It's not positional, although it can be. It's also not performative, although it can be. I think of like the royal family in England. Like, they're not really leading anything or guiding anything, but they are symbolic leaders of a country. They're a family that represents the family of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Whether you agree with it or not, that's the role they're attempting to fill. So they're a symbolic performative leadership group, a family that's supposed to symbolize something and perform that out. Mm-hmm. But true leader, I wouldn't consider them true leaders. They're more symbols than leaders. True leaders actually have something they're guiding us toward. They're directing us toward. They're helping us go from point A to point B or Z or beyond.
Yeah, well, I would say that there probably is some form of leadership there. It's just that the symbolic position existed first.
Yeah.
And then people fill it. I think when you're making a contrast between what leadership is and is not, I think when a person, they find themselves in a position, but it's not symbolic, and yet they act as if it is.
Yeah.
That's the problem. And that's when things are performative. Like, we have a lot of challenge with that, I think, in American politics. A lot of it feels real performative, right? It feels positional and performative. It feels like theater, really.
The Kardashians go to Washington kind of energy.
Yes, exactly. And I would say that the Kardashians are very much in positions of leadership as well, because they're highly influential to trends and, how people want to grow up and who they want to become when they when they get older. Like, there's a real leadership quality there, whether or not that's fully realized or understood or always managed in the most responsible way. There's still that component there. And there always is with influencers. But American politics is really interesting. I just recently saw a video. I don't know, it wasn't very long, and I don't know if it had gone viral or if I just ran into it, but it was a congressman on a day that was like a work day, like a legitimate work day, not a holiday. It wasn't like, the end of December or anything. And it was a legitimate work day where they had, I think he and a couple of other people just, sponsored a bill. And he said, there's two people in this room. There's the person who's supposed to be guiding the meeting. The speaker, who always has to be there. And him. And he's like, and where is everybody else? Nobody's here.
Yeah. And
what's so funny is he said, we should be here arguing about this bill. We should be here talking about it. We should be going back and forth on the costs and benefits of it. We should be kind of maybe even a little at each other's throats about it in order to make sure it's in the public's best interest, but nobody's here but me.
Yeah.
And what's so funny is I see the Congress as being filled more increasingly with younger people who are very active on social media, have millions of followers, both sides of the aisle, by the way. Lots of people who follow them, and they're supposed to be in these positions of leadership, but their actual day job of being in that room, where are they? Right. But I'm sure if you followed them on that same day, they would have, tweeted a couple things and maybe made a stand about something. But what is the actual position? Is it performance on Twitter, or is it actually being in the seat during, a meeting at Congress and arguing about a bill?
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I actually don't see very many of those people as leaders. And that's another distinction I want to make and this has been huge when I had this aha in my own life. There's a huge difference between somebody who's a manager and someone who's a leader. Mm. And I would argue most people in politics, for example, most people in business, most people, even your boss, if you're listening right now, I bet you your boss is not a leader. the person in charge of you, your lead, the person you have to report to at work, I bet you they're a manager. Because the managerial class, we know this since the Industrial Revolution, has been growing endlessly. It's larger now than ever. And when I say managerial class, I mean people that have a sense of responsibility for themselves and others and like a task to get done. Usually it's inside of a larger organization. And they're tasked with the how of how this will be accomplished on a regular recurring schedule, whether it's a maintenance type work or whether it's a project they have to do. Their job is to get that across the finish line. It's not necessarily to lead towards something new or to lead something. Now they're, in a sense, taking the lead. So I have to be careful with my language here because someone that's using introverted thinking like you use, Antonia, is going to pick it apart. Like, well, that you said this and it's contradicting this. I get the point. Get the understanding, get the idea, the broad brush idea here. Leadership, and this is a mantra, and this is not truth. This is a maxim. This is not truth. This is a statement to get an idea across. Okay, this is not truth. Leadership is taken, not given. But management is given. When I say leadership is taken, not given, meaning you can, again, show with leadership energy regardless of a role or position you have. But a manager has to have the role or position to do their job. And I would argue that most of Congress, most of academia, most of business, most of religion, most of these organizations where we quote unquote talk about and bandy about the idea of leadership and all the quote unquote leadership books that we read and materials we engage and the leadership training, it's all management training, management books, management. And with this huge managerial class that basically makes our world possible. And I don't think we should mistake that for leadership. I think those are two very different things. And we can go down the whole rabbit hole of that, but I don't think that's useful now because I want to bring this back to personality type. But leadership is taken, not given. And if you have to have a vote to say, well, that person's in the lead, they're not really a leader. Like they could be elected to a position, but they were probably a leader before they were ratified into that position. Like their energy was already moving things forward. People were already following them. And then a group got together and said, well, let's just make this official. Let's just give them a title and a position because they're already doing it. And then you ratify it.
Yeah. That's
very different than saying, looking around going, who among us is qualified? Let's all take a consensus check-in and then put that person in position. That never works. Anytime that happens, you just place somebody there, they don't do well.
Well, it's okay to have a stand-in for a time. But I think you're totally right. I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution. You just mentioned that was the birthplace of the managerial class to some extent. And now we have a really kind of a disconcertingly high population of the managerial class.
Yeah.
For better and for worse.
And it's destroying leadership across the globe.
I think that
as far as I'm concerned.
I think it's definitely made it difficult because we do conflate those two concepts. But during the Industrial Revolution, that's when unions were formed. And unions were formed to improve the workplace for people who were the poor folk, right? That couldn't get better opportunities, the working class. And the unions were pretty much like spearheaded by the working class who were done. And it was the leaders within. They were like the little leaders who decided that they weren't going to take certain things anymore. And they organized. I mean, anybody who was part of the working class that helped organize a union probably outclassed all the leaders above them until you get to the highest echelons. Like the person who originally created the company may have also had the same, like levels or energetic channels of leadership, but they were basically doing the exact same thing, only at a, like at a less resourced level.
And I think they were battling against managers, not leaders. I think they were battling against positional managers who were placed there that probably didn't deserve it, didn't earn it. They were placed there, elected there, placed there by whoever, that took advantage of their position and treated the working class poorly, didn't give them benefits, all the things that they didn't extend to them because they didn't really know what it took to get to that place. They were just placed there as a manager and they abused their power. And then everybody went, well, that's what a bad leader looks like, doesn't it? Well, no, that's not a bad leader. That's a bad manager. And those two different things. So don't conflate a bad manager, your boss, who's your manager in a place of power over you, as somebody that's necessarily not a good leader. They're probably not leading anything. They probably don't have any leadership qualities.
Well, they are two different things. One is a position and one is a characteristic or quality. And they can exist in the same person.
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked more jobs than I care to remember.
I'm being hyperbolic. Obviously, you might have a manager that's a great leader too. I'm being overly provocative and sensational when I say this.
Right. Well, and probably in order for people to detether
Yeah.
the concept from each other, like those two things have a tendency to be very much married to each other, but they really aren't. And I've worked for so many different people, and I have had managers or bosses, people who led the company, you know, if it was a small to mid-sized company, or people who were managers in larger companies. And I've had some that were clear leaders, and they were on their way up, honestly. If a person's a manager and a leader simultaneously, they're not there for long, right?
Yeah.
This is just a moment for them. They're on their trajectory up, because it's so hard to find a good leader. And then I've had ones that are terrible that'll be there for the rest of their lives as long as they can be, right? Fingers crossed. And sometimes a good manager isn't a good leader.
Yeah.
Yeah, like sometimes you don't want your manager to be too good a leader.
And we need both.
We need both. Yeah, exactly. That said, I kind of want to go back to, by the way, some introverted thinking user is going to say, when you were like, don't pick it apart. I'm just saying it's not the truth. It's a maxim. Somebody's going to say a maxim is a truth. So I just want to point that out so you don't
Fair
have
enough.
that coming at you. No, I understand. TP types, we're impossible. We're impossible human beings. But
I've seen your kind before.
yeah, I know what I'm getting into. So I wanted to go back to what you mentioned before, which is this idea, because I think maybe some pushback might come from the idea that if you're in a position of leadership, the things you have to offer up are not commensurate with what the privileges you receive. And then you mentioned that the thing you actually get is purpose. And as soon as you said that, I wrote down the word resources, because I do think that when you're in a position of leadership and you're good, right, in a position of, and you are also a good leader, right, simultaneously. Let's go back to conflating leadership with the positions and being in a position of power or desire of that.
Yeah.
The benefit is that you do get higher access to resource, because that's part of leading.
You have to have access to resource.
Exactly.
Because otherwise you can't do your job.
Exactly.
Including human resource.
Exactly. That's what leadership is.
Yes.
Leadership is amassing resource of some kind.
Yes.
In order to get things accomplished or to direct people in certain ways.
But by definition, it's outsized power. Like you have more power than one person should have. That's what you have as a leader, both power over people as human resources and actual resource.
Yep.
And that's what we push back in our culture when we don't like the idea, oh, that person shouldn't be in leadership. It's because they have more power than we are comfortable with. But if they're a good leader, they wield that power appropriately, and they don't harm anybody, and they step down when it's the right time. Like they don't hold on to it longer than they should.
Yes, which is the direction I want to go. So outsized power, outsized, access to resource. That's exactly it. Now, you said they have more power than one person should have. I know
mean, in people's heads.
In people's heads,
yeah,
exactly.
Like people believe that about a leader.
Right. If a person is a good leader, though, they have exactly the amount of resource that a single person should have.
Yes.
They have the amount of resource that a leader should have. And even in that situation, if they are a good leader, I would still say that your statement holds true, that the privileges and the access to outsized resource is still not commensurate with the position, because there's a lot of stuff that comes with being a leader that is very, very thankless.
Yeah.
Like you get all the criticism, you get all the responsibility. Like you can't do enough to make it so that everybody's happy with you. You are going to get criticized. It's just like you have to build a thick skin if you're a leader, because you are going to get a bunch of criticism. And I mean, who knows what percentage of it is completely unqualified criticism?
Well, not just criticism, but projection of ill intent, which is a very particular kind of criticism. You're ill-intended. You're trying to harm people. You're trying to hurt others, which is really hard to hear.
Yep. And you also get all the responsibility for the outcome. This idea that things have become too big to fail, this is a very new idea, I think, to some extent. And only because everything is so interconnected.
Yeah.
But for a long time, there's been a whole history of people who were at the top of the food chain socially, like monarchs and kings and queens, that people didn't like what they did, and then they just kind of removed them from the gene pool, right? They were like, okay, you're done. We're not happy with you anymore. And so the people in positions of leadership are in high positions of responsibility. They have to account for their actions. And if they don't do the job, along with all of that criticism and, projection of ill intent, right? They're done. It's complete. So that stack a resource, right? Which could include things like money, but it also includes status. It includes credibility, right? I had attention and human energy written down as well. You get an outsized amount of attention. You get an outsized amount of human energy at your disposal. But despite the fact that you get all of these resources, you have to make sure that you're using them well. Just like if you get everybody's attention and you have no place to point them to, people will get really salty about that. They'll be like, I paid you attention. Yeah. I paid it, right? So what are you going to do in return? I expect that you're going to send me a direction because I am without direction. And that's what leaders are supposed to do, is they're supposed to help you have direction.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to do that. It's very hard to galvanize people together to make something bigger happen, whatever that might be. It's hard to traverse a territory and then come back and say, I know the way, particularly since we're in a time period in history where there's so much undiscovered country, so to speak. There's so much terrain that nobody's explored.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of pattern recognition that's necessary. We might not have even seen things like this yet. It's a totally new landscape. And yet we still need leaders bringing us to the next place, which is probably why we're really suffering and lacking solid leadership. Because it's hard to go, I'll be a leader when we're entering undiscovered, territory or country, knowing that you're going to get all the criticism and the projection of ill intent, and you don't even have the certainty to go, and I know I'm going to get to the other side because I've been here before.
Yeah.
So that idea of purpose, why would anybody do it then, right? If it's such a pain and there's not that much benefit, resource, yes, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily getting a ton of benefit from that situation. Usually you have to, outsized resource comes with outsized working hours and outsized criticism and responsibility, etc. Then why would a person do it? And the answer, you mentioned the answer before, is purpose. Yeah. It has to be fulfilling. It has to be something the person's like, this is what I was meant to do. Yeah. And you were talking about profile training, which at the beginning of this episode, I was like, I don't really like responsibility of leadership. I'm not really a big fan of leadership. I don't think about it because I don't really like it and I don't really want to be there. And yet at profile training, it's, like we're both leading from a stage. We're both running this conference. And I can't help but deny that I'm in a position of leadership in all of that. But it doesn't feel like all the bad stuff that usually comes with it because it feels like purpose. Yeah. It's like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, so I guess I just have to keep doing that. It doesn't matter whether or not we just broke even on that event. Or it doesn't matter if at the end of it I'm exhausted, but I still got to go home to a kid who might be missing me. Or I've been there with Piper in tow the whole week and I'm kind of exhausted. It doesn't matter. It's what I'm supposed to be doing, so I have to keep doing it.
I want to work out an idea live here that I haven't actually thought of until just now. Okay. So play with me on this. Tell me how this lands with you. As I'm thinking about leadership, I'm realizing, so let me just say it this way. If we think about fame has been democratized, meaning that it used to be you had to be a movie star to have fame, or you had to be significant in some way. The system, the cultural system around us had to somehow prop you up and put you in the spotlight. Usually it was based on competence, but it could be based on other factors. And then we found, 20 years ago, we mentioned the Kardashians earlier, they figured out how to hack fame. This is before social media, but they figured out how to be famous for being famous and being wealthy. And they hacked into the system and they got one level down in democratization of fame. And then social media enters the scene. And now anyone with an Instagram account, a YouTube channel can, in a sense, simulate what it's like to be a movie star. If you put the effort in, if you are attractive enough, if you've got the right message, if you position yourself, if you dress well, you can basically simulate fame or actually get really famous. Like there's famous YouTubers that have never been in a mainstream movie. They've never been on television, but they're more famous than maybe a movie star was 50 years ago. Like more people know of them globally. So we've seen in culture the democratization of everything, including fame. Like everything's being democratized. Everybody can start their own business. Everybody can publish their own book on Amazon. Everybody can publish their own music on SoundCloud or iTunes or whatever. Like we are able to do what only you could do with a major company before. Now we've got private companies taking space shuttles into space. I bet the next frontier will be democratization of space travel. Probably individuals could build their own spacecraft and go into space eventually, like with technology. So technology keeps democratizing everything. Except I bet you leadership can't be democratized. We want to. We have an affectation for it. We desire it so much because we see all the privilege and the benefits. We don't have a sense of what it takes to get there because we've only seen people in quote unquote leadership positions that are actually managers. They're not real leaders, and they've abused maybe their position. Maybe they've lorded over us. Maybe we haven't been really great with it. Maybe we've been in one of those roles and we haven't done a great job. We didn't know what we were doing.
You see a crappy manager or leader and you're like, I could do that. I could be a crappy manager.
Yeah.
Put me in a position of leadership.
We don't know what it takes because if somebody in a management role didn't have to necessarily they didn't have to go through the things to claim that. They might have just been put there or hired there or just found themselves there.
Well, they had to, whatever their food chain is, whatever the ladder is for that particular position.
I want to make a clear comment. Clearly there's good managers. Clearly there's people that deserve it, that have earned it. I'm not saying that it's like a one size fits all here. And this is a general idea to get a point across. In a world, though, that we think leadership should be democratized, like I should be more impactful in the world. I should be more important for the things I say and the leadership I bring forward. I could see why there's a culture of people online needing to make a case for something or position for something. I could see the reason why activism, for example, no matter what political spectrum or religious tone, like there's people that are activists for all sorts of causes. So I'm not picking on any one particular cause. I'm talking about the energy of activism itself. It almost feels like someone who has a desire for leadership to step into leading and guiding something forward. It doesn't know where to put that. But we've gotten this message in our culture, particularly Western culture, that everything should be democratized. And so it should be democratized. I should be able to be a leader. And so I step into trying to make an impact in the world, try to make an effect in the world, I want to be more than I am. And I feel like it should be right there. Mm-hmm. And it's not, because it's, again, leadership can only be taken. It cannot be given. It's one of those things. I don't believe it can be democratized. I don't think it can. I think it's one of the few things you actually have to earn, like genuinely earn. You can't just get it. You can't just download an app, the leadership app. Now I'm a leader. Look, I posted my profile. Like, we try that, but it doesn't work. And I think that message is messing us up because we don't actually know what it takes to step into leadership. We don't actually know what it takes to get a coalition of people toward a goal or a project. We don't actually know what it takes to take that leadership for ourselves. And even if we did, we might personally feel bad about it or weirdly insecure about it. And we know certainly that our peers or other people might go, oh, you don't have the right to step into that and lord it over me or assert yourself in that. And so we shrink back and we just really hope that maybe an app could solve it, or someone will tell us it's okay to step in there, or they'll put us there. Or all of our peers will say, you're the one that should be doing this, and prop us up. Mm-hmm. And so we want to play nice with our peers, and we want to be above reproach in every possible thing, because any day we might be put on. We might be asked to take the lead in something. And I think this is part of why we have a vacuum of leadership in our world. Is I don't think we fully, truly understand it with the new modern mindset of everything's democratized, right? Well, I don't think it is. And I think this is really messing us up as humans.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
So what do you think about that idea? I mean, I'm playing it. Maybe it's a complete BS idea. I don't know.
Well, and if you think about what you just said and you go, I don't believe any of that at all, just let me know. But I actually think that you're onto a couple different things. The first one is that when everybody believes they should be a leader or an influencer or whatever they want to say, all it creates is a lot of noise and cacophony. Leadership isn't usually, well, there are kinds of leadership that are articulated, like thought leadership, etc. But actual, like, guiding people to a, pointing to direction, getting everybody together, truly guiding somebody through, or groups of people through something, that's not usually articulated. That's action. And so, and a lot of modern quote unquote action is just different iterations of articulation, right? Which is like saying things on social media, or even putting something on a video, taking an action, putting it on video and uploading it is still a form of expression or articulation. It's very different from like going, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it and let's go, which is a little bit closer to the kind of leadership you're talking about. I also think that we have availability to democratize leadership. It's just self-leadership. Mm-hmm. That's the only kind of leadership that can be democratized is self-leadership. And that's one that personally I'm very interested in. Self-leadership is extremely interesting to me. Leading other people, maybe. But self-leadership, absolutely.
When you say self-leadership, that actually resonates with me. I think that actually is something that can be democratized because it's about the self.
Right. And here's, maybe my thoughts are bottlenecking a little bit, but here's the balance of all this, or maybe the choreography of it. In order to be a truly great leader to others, one has to first self-lead. And that means that they have to do that work. They have to have leadership over self. Ship close to shape, molding, changing.
Yeah.
And the aspect that when you get into a position of leadership, the fantasy that this is going to be all great and you're going to now be in a position of power and influence and leadership and have access to all these resources and everybody's going to think you're great. The fantasy of that for good leaders, it very quickly gets squashed, or they never believe that at all. They were, groomed to be a leader, and they knew that was not part of it. Or they found themselves in positions of leadership and then they went, oh, this sucks actually in a lot of different ways. But if they're first self-leaders, then the person is tapped into what it means to be, like, to have, say, self-discipline. The ability to do things when they're hard, but do them because they're good for you. And self-control and self-management and all those other things that come along with being a leader, but doing it for the self, right? Putting your wishes aside for what's in your best interest and being willing to take the hit for something that is actually ultimately good. Going to bed early and getting up and doing stretches because that's what your body needs, as opposed to going to bed late because you just wanted to watch that next episode of whatever on Netflix. Like, these self-discipline components, which might seem small, are required for true self-leadership, which can be democratized. And if a person hasn't figured out self-leadership, it's very difficult for them to lead other people.
Yeah.
That said, if you do that, then when you get into that position of leadership, the position, not necessarily the characteristic, but when you get into that position, if you haven't figured this piece out, then you are going to use the outsized resources and you're going to siphon them because the position still sucks, right? You're still going to get the position itself is what gets all that criticism. The position itself is what has all that responsibility. But if you don't carry the characteristic of leadership in with it, first starting with the self, then you are going to start exploiting the outsized access to resource that is there because otherwise it's not worth it, right? Like, why would I do this job unless I got this outrageous salary? Why would I do this unless I got all of this attention or all of these extra privileges or all this indulgence? Like, this position sucks, so I've earned this.
Yeah.
If a person is a true self-leader and they started with that, the thing that I agree can be democratized, if you start with that, then when you find yourself in those positions, but you bring the characteristic of leadership to it, you knew all that was coming because you already felt all of it. You already felt like that it sucks to have to put yourself aside for a bigger thing. But just like when you did it for yourself, there were all these rewards of like, yeah, but it all works out. I'm a better person. Now I'm the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This is what I should be doing. This feels like more me. You can bring that characteristic into the position because you have the characteristic of leadership, and now purpose is enough. And now you don't try to exploit the riches and the resources. You're not trying to make it balance out because it never will. There isn't enough resource out there to balance out how much it sucks to be in a high position of leadership. So that's one of the reasons why I think we see such a vacuum of it. And I think it can be democratized. It's just, I think what we've democratized is the idea that I should be leading others. But most people are not qualified for that. We have to lead self first. And then when we get good at that, then maybe we'll think about it for other people. Yeah.
I think it's a parent that taught me that early on, that I can't ask my kids to do stuff that I can't figure out how to do for myself. And setting the example is so important in how I behave and all the unspoken messages that you're sending to people that you have to do for yourself. And I think that's that concept of, you want to change the world, make your bed in the morning, like clean up your room, make sure your bills are paid and you are on a schedule and you're taking care of your health and like all the basics. Lead yourself through all of those things. Not when I say pay the bills, I mean, obviously if you're struggling, find the resource you need to do to live a life that's good, whatever that means.
Well, that's
for
part,
you.
I mean, that is part of self-leadership though.
Yeah.
Is making sure that you have access to the resources you need.
Yeah. And it's getting serious about leading the self toward something greater. And I think that's really what we've been talking a lot with, different clients and students. We've talked a lot about how you're wired as a personality, to know yourself, how you interface with others. And it's like, okay, great. I know this now, Joel and Antonia. What do I do with that? Where do I go with it? And that's really where self-leadership comes in. How do you know what to do with the knowledge of personality type? Let's just take the 4 judging cognitive functions of personality. So these are the 4 different ways that people make decisions or evaluate criteria in the world. And these are I think the best way to look through leadership as a real cursory beginning point for that. When we talk about leadership and we think of it in terms of structure and hierarchy and accomplishing something in the outside world, getting the job done, accomplishing goals, managing resource, all of this, all that language is laden with a very particular cognitive function viewpoint or bent, which is the cognitive function or decision-making function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. This is the decision-making function that all TJs in the Myers-Briggs system use. So INTJs, ISTJs, ENTJs, ESTJs use this as the best way to make decisions. If you notice, in most organizations, there's an awful lot of TJs in both management and leadership. Places like the military, business, anywhere there's a hierarchy, and the hierarchy needs to be navigated, and resource needs to be managed, and projects need to happen. Like outer world things have to be done, and people have to be organized. Often you'll find a lot of TJ personality types gathered and clustered in those realms, those energies, those organizations. So I think that's naturally when we think about leadership, we almost unconsciously, even if we don't know personality type, we assume that it's a extroverted thinking effectiveness user at the helm often. But there's other styles of leadership, not just extroverted thinking or effectiveness leadership. I would argue that each of the judging functions has a different style. You, Antonia, as your best fit type ENTP, you don't use extroverted thinking or effectiveness. You actually make your best decisions with introverted thinking, or what we've nicknamed accuracy. This is about logical, consistent, congruent thought, about what makes sense to you logically, all the internal logic inside your own mind. And so you mentioned at the very beginning of this episode that when you think about leadership, you don't really naturally think about the structural, hierarchical, organizational leadership. You think of, and you said it, thought leadership. Mm-hmm. You think of influencing the way people think inside their brains, what they believe, how clean their thoughts are, how they're organizing information inside their head. This is the style that you lend yourself to because, well, that would make sense. That's how you're wired. So when you show up to leadership, you're probably going to do it through the lens or the channel of trying to influence thought in other people, get them to change or calibrate their thoughts. And so I think that's another style of leadership. And as you're listening, just as we go through these 4 judging functions, just kind of like get a sense of which one you resonate with as we talk about it. Anything you want to add to that before I keep going? Because I can list these out and we can unpack it.
Yeah. So I think that's also why self-leadership is so much more interesting to me, because there's a quality in introverted thinking or accuracy that's about self-amelioration. Yeah. Whereas I think you're right. We naturally tend to think of extroverted thinking or effectiveness as a leadership function because that focuses on ameliorating systems.
It's also obvious in the outer world. We can see it.
That's right. It's more outcome focused. Whereas introverted thinking or accuracy is more process focused. Yeah. I'm way more interested in the process of something, and I just assume the outcome will take care of itself. And I don't really want to be responsible for the outcome. I just want to make sure that the process is really good. And that's not usually what we think of when we think of leadership. But in thought leadership, it's helpful because thinking is a process. And so that is what I tend to gravitate towards. For you, using introverted feeling or authenticity, what's your leadership style?
I'll just say that introverted thinking accuracy is used by all TPs in the Myers-Briggs system. So INTPs, ISTPs, ENTPs, and ESTPs will use this as their best decision-making tool in their cognition. And this is they probably have a proclivity toward thought leadership. For me, I have ENFP best fit type preferences. I use the judging or decision-making function of introverted feeling. We've nicknamed it authenticity. This is all about inner alignment, congruity of core values, about motivation, desire, tracking intentions, understanding intention. I think the style of leadership that often FPs, so this is the judging function, decision-making function used by all FPs in the Myers-Briggs system. So INFPs, ENFPs, ISFPs, ESFPs. I think it's inspirational leadership. It's creating desire in other people. It's creating motivation in other people. It's getting them excited or attuned to what's possible inside of themselves. So it's an introverted function. It looks at the inside. It's not as obvious in the outer world, but it's trying to reach into someone's heart and inspire them to greatness, inspire them to something more, inspire them to feel successful or on purpose or on mission. And so I think that inspiration comes through in the leadership style of a lot of FPs. Now, we can all tap into all of these. I can tap into thought leadership and external leadership or inspirational leadership. I don't think we're just locked down by personality type to one, but I do think that we tend to lend ourselves toward one of these based on how we're wired. And then finally, the final judging function that we could talk about is another feeling function. It's extroverted feeling. We've nicknamed it harmony. It's about getting needs met in the outer world. It's about the feelings out here between people, social groups, entire organizations or countries or societies, or all the way down just to a small family unit. It's about really creating the harmony in a social space, no matter the scale of what that looks like. And again, harmony or extroverted feeling is used by all FJ types in the Myers-Briggs system. So INFJs, ENFJs, ISFJs, ESFJs use harmony or extroverted feeling. And I think that's a very social leadership frame. So it's about, consensus, possibly committee, about making sure all voices are heard. Everybody gets a voice, gets an opinion, gets a vote. I think there's a lot of social, and also keeping the social fabric together, like helping guide people groups towards something. So it could be allowing everybody to have a voice, but it'll also be, I will lead this forward and get everybody's needs met. I'll drive what needs to happen. I'll make the single voice, but it's on everybody else's behalf. It's a social leadership frame.
Well, and I think that cooperation is really a part of this.
Great word.
And I don't think that all people who use extroverted feeling or harmony, I think I've always had a tendency to see it as consensus oriented. And I do think it can be consensus oriented. I think that is a lower level of it, though.
Coalition, would that be a better word for you?
No, I think cooperation is the higher order word. And the reason why I've seen people who use extroverted feeling or harmony very much understand the importance of hierarchy, right? They get that one of the needs that people have is a strong leader to follow. And so I think it's more about cooperation regardless of where the person is at. Yeah. And making sure that everybody's getting their need. Like, even if you are at a place that most people would think is not that important, your role's still important. You're still important. Your needs need to be met, so you'll show up every day. And so it's a matter of making sure that there is sort of the glue between people in these human systems.
I'm going to make you do thought labor.
Oh, okay.
I need you to help me make a distinction about something in my own mind, if you would be willing.
Yeah.
The reason why I think the word consensus or coalition makes more sense is because often FJ types will use, in order to lead, they will use shunning or shaming to push somebody out of the group. They'll create a consensus around the people that are bought in with them to move forward. And anyone that's not bought in that, everyone, like, they can't get full cooperation because the rogue elements are there. So the best, I mean, I guess that's an ideal. I don't know if that could ever be achieved, but cooperation would not exclude somebody by disapproving of them. Disapproval is, we have consensus here. If you don't join in the consensus, you're on the outs. And that's how we lead as FJs. I think that's how I have it in my head. So if you could maybe calibrate how what you said and how I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
Like, how am I thinking about that differently? Or how am I thinking about that uncalibratedly?
Well, I mean, I guess it would depend on the context that the leadership is in, but I would still insist that cooperation is a better word than consensus.
Okay.
because the person who is hemorrhaged out isn't a person who isn't agreeing. It's a person who is not cooperating with their role.
Okay.
And so on some, like when a person
appointed role or role they naturally own themselves,
the role that they need to be doing in this ecosystem.
Gotcha.
Right. The role that they either went for themselves or were assigned or whatever. But in this ecosystem, everybody's got a role.
Yeah.
And if you're not like you can be as sour as you want to. And I mean when extroverted feeling or harmony is at a higher level of leadership. I think when it's at a lower level of leadership, it wants consensus because it wants everybody's mind to be in alignment with each other. It has a bit of a fantasy around introverted thinking or accuracy that we could somehow make it so that everybody's programmed to think the same thing. I think when somebody who has this function has integrated introverted thinking, they know that's not possible. Everybody's going to be thinking different things because they have owned that they themselves are not in alignment with everybody else on everything. So they've integrated the part of themselves that understands that you cannot do mind control. It's just not possible. And that's why consensus is a nice to have. If everybody's in consensus, that's great. But it's not, it's an ideal. It's not going to always happen. But I don't really need you to like your job. I just need you to do your job. It's kind of an extroverted thinking or effectiveness way of looking at it. And I think extroverted feeling or harmony is more like, you don't have to like your job. I'll do everything I can to make your job better for you, but it still needs to be done.
Yeah.
So can you cooperate, please? Can you get part of this group? And if we all cooperate, we'll get this done together. Many hands make light work, right?
Okay.
And so I think that's why I would say cooperation is the higher order than consensus. And I think every single one of these functions we're talking about has a higher and a lower order, like effectiveness, extroverted thinking. At a lower order, it's just about getting everybody to do their job, like make it happen. And I'll throw money at you, or I'll just, you're replaceable. I'll build a system to do it instead of a human. And, like, and if you don't do your job, you're out. I'm firing you, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when extroverted thinking or effectiveness is at a higher order, they have great appreciation for every person who's filling these positions. And while the position might not need that specific human being, there's still like a sense of honor and respect that that person is doing their job well. And then they find more opportunities for that person to do those kinds of jobs. They start talent scouting them and looking for ways to like sort of leverage them and give them a place where they feel a higher sense of purpose. Yeah. Because I think they understand that every person, if they've tapped into and integrated their introverted feeling or authenticity, everybody needs to feel inspired. They need to feel like they're doing something with their life, right? This is the one human experience they get, and everybody needs to feel like whatever they're doing with this human experience was worth something. So the higher level, higher order extroverted thinking or effectiveness honors that person needs to have a sense of purpose. Just like a higher order extroverted feeling or harmony understands that everybody gets to have their own thoughts and opinions on things. Yeah. Yeah. Did that help? Was that the thought labor you're looking for?
Absolutely. In fact, you changed my mind on it, or you kind of switched it. I was seeing the cooperation as the ideal, but I think the consensus is actually more the ideal. I think cooperation is probably more the real of it. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I think that, thank you, by the way, for helping clarify that for me. However, I would say that there is some sense of approaching leadership in your strengths. Mm-hmm. And often we have to take leadership in areas that we feel deeply uncertain around. This is where things can be challenging for us as people. As an example, we were on a Q&A this past weekend, one of our question and answer for one of our high-level programs. It's called Profiler Dynamics. It's one of the advanced classes that after you go through our Profiler Training 101 class and you learn how to do a real profiling session with another person, we have a bunch of advanced classes you can take. Advanced profiling, profiler coaching, and this one's called Profiler Dynamics. It's designed to start laying down the tracks of what we do with our clients in real time, our real world coaching, mentorship groups, all the things that we do with type dynamics and how we coach with them. So we teach other students how to do what we do with clients. And we were just having this call, and one of the students, one of the alumni from Profiler Training who's in this new dynamics class, her name's Jenny, and she's the executive director of a nonprofit. And she has INFP preferences. And we were having a conversation about how she shows up in leadership as the director of this nonprofit. And I reflected to her, we're talking about the inferior or 3-year-old cognitive function in her personality, or in personality, and we were talking about it. And it somehow in the conversation we came to, I reflected to her, I said, in your leadership role, we're talking about uncertainty. I said, you've had to pull on your 3-year-old or inferior cognitive function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness in a hierarchical structured organization. You're at the top. You have to manage all this resource, all these people, all these projects, all these things that have to happen. You've got to show up in leadership there. And I bet that's deeply uncertain for you. She said, yeah, I have to be there so much. She said, but there's an interesting thing. I went to profiler training a few months ago, and I've been working on myself and really thinking about this. And I always thought that my talent, this is what she reported to us, my talent of introverted feeling or authenticity wasn't very useful in a leadership fashion. I thought I had to go to the structural leadership of effectiveness or extroverted thinking in my inferior 3-year-old. But I was at a meeting with my executives or leadership team the other day, and we were talking about some things, and they were asking me how to do something. And normally in those meetings, Joel and Antonia, I would go to that 3-year-old or inferior function and try to think of all the logistics and the things that have to happen in the outside world. And what I did differently this time is I pulled upon my driver or dominant function of introverted feeling or authenticity as an INFP. And I started to talk about the meaning and the purpose of this nonprofit that we run and what we're trying to accomplish for people and the core values we have as an organization. And she was reporting to us that she could almost feel the energy flowing through her, almost like leadership energy just boiled up out of her. And she said it was really unique and interesting and beautiful and a wonderful experience. Maybe I got those words exactly wrong, but the idea I'm communicating from what she told us anecdotally was she felt alive, she felt attuned, she felt on mission, she felt like she was in her strengths, and she had certainty in how she was communicating. And she said her leadership team lit up around that. They were excited about the projects they were working on. She inspired them. We talked about inspirational leadership. She inspired them to what they're doing in this organization. Why are we even doing this? She inspired them. And she said it was an amazing feeling for her and the leadership team. And it's something that she's like, I have access to this. I've been diminishing it. I've been ignoring it. I've been going down to other parts of my personality that I'm more uncertain around to be a leader. And yet I've got this amazing tool. It doesn't look like you're taught in management school or business school or leadership school. It looks different. It's more inspirational. It's more emotionally driven. But yet she's seasoned. She knows how to wield it. It's absolutely the right tool for the job, often in her leadership role. And so that story to me indicates that there's a lot more opportunities for you listening right now, no matter what your personality type is, for anyone that's listening, to do leadership in the way that actually makes sense to you, that you can bring the best gifts of yourself, how you're uniquely wired, to the world. You don't have to do it the way it's structurally set up. You don't have to do it the way your college professor said, or your parents said, or your last boss said, or anybody's told you, or a management book tells you to do it. You can show up in a way that makes sense to you. How do you take leadership, step into that role, and help move people to the next level?
Yeah. And I think we should assume that everybody who's doing that is also a good faith actor. They're doing it for good.
Well, we can assume that. We can't control that. We might have a dictator in the making listening right now, ooh.
We'll give them the schematics of taking over.
But we actually have a friend who has run the numbers on how, I think, TJ preferences, but runs the numbers on how much it would take to overthrow a country or take over a country.
Yeah. He was naming countries and it would only be $125,000 to hire mercenaries.
Yeah, actual metrics. And I'm wow, okay, that's some real so I guess if that's you, we can't really stop you, but hopefully you're using this for good.
Yeah. All right. Do you have more you want to say on? I think I feel pretty good about the topic of leadership. If a person is like me, that's not, I kind of sometimes find myself in that position, but the truth is that I'm not that interested in leading other people in a more extroverted thinking or effectiveness way, which is probably a little bit of how I envision it. But I'm always interested in self-leadership. And there are ways and opportunities for me to put myself in a position of responsibility that can help other people out.
Well, it could also be useful to somebody listening if you have somebody that you are following that's in leadership over you and they're a particular personality type.
Yeah.
Just to know what maybe their insecurities are, what their strengths are, how are they showing up, how to relate to them more. So what do you think? You haven't had a microphone. You've been listening to us talk. We want to hear from you. What's coming up with the concept of leadership in your own life, in the people you see, maybe how you were raised? Maybe you've changed your mind around it. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your leadership story. Have you stepped into leadership yourself? What's that like? Have you succeeded, failed, calibrated? What's going on there? Do you have a really weird relationship with leadership? Do you are okay with it? Like how is your relationship with leadership? I'd love to know this. I'd like to hear from you and kind of get a real sense of how you're relating to this material. What's happening for you on your side? So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We have a video podcast on YouTube. Come check out our channel. Watch us in real time so you can look at Joel's lovely flowing locks while you listen to me pontificate. And when you get there, if you enjoyed it, you can like and subscribe and hit that little bell that lets you know when a new episode is out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
Yeah, that was good. That was a good ending.
I got through it.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.